Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Daga Hall. Nice to see everyone on a Friday afternoon. Why am I speaking with a microphone? I'm not going to give a song. It's because we're live streaming, okay? So we have to do all our questions, etc., with the microphone, but Professor Papatheodorou is all mic'd up, so he's okay. So thank you all for joining us, either here in 821 or remotely through live streaming, our experiment with live streaming. So before I do the formal welcome to Professor Andreas Papatheodorou, this is a D.HTM distinguished lecture. So what is one of them? Well, in SHTM, we're very proud of the D.HTM program. And I guess our Dean, Professor Chon, his idea was to help broadcast D.HTM, which in the world is a fairly new concept. So we all know what a PhD is. But a D.HTM being a professional doctorate in hotel and tourism management, at the moment this is the only one in the world. So we're different from the others, but for those of you who don't know, we have 200 students doing our D.HTM. Over 100 here in Hong Kong and almost 100 in mainland China. So very substantial numbers. It's a very important initiative for us in building industry capacity. We have a lot of very senior industry people doing this program, and Benson, the head of Association of Corporate Travel Executives here in the front row, is an example of senior industry people. We also have many distinguished academics who are upgrading their skills. So D.HTM is about building industry capacity here in Hong Kong, China and beyond, and it's also about building educational, scholarly capacity. Our program's been going for now over 10 years, since 2007, and we've had over 70 graduates. That's a lot of doctoral graduates. So China is a country with a big population, so to actually make a difference, you have to do things at scale, and that's what we're trying to do with the D.HTM. Students from all over the world, from Africa, Latin America, from the United States, and of course from Asia, and from Hong Kong, Macau, and from mainland China. So very, very international. And we're delighted that Professor Andreas Papatheodorou has accepted our invitation to be our latest D.HTM distinguished lecturer. So Andreas and I have known one another for a long time. We just came down from Guangzhou in the train today. We arrived about 3 hours ago?
Yeah, 3 hours ago.
And we were celebrating last night, so are we tired? No, he's been in Hotel Icon, so he's able to refresh after his arrival.
Absolutely.
Now, and Andreas gave a presentation in Guangzhou, which was very well received. It's great on his topic, which is about international aviation in Hong Kong airport, to have an overseas perspective on what's going on. I mean, we all have views about Hong Kong airports, about aviation, etc., and some in the room have specialized in aviation. But Professor Papatheodorou has been working in this area for many years, and I think his qualifications are very impressive. So he did his master's at University of Oxford, and then that was in economics, and then PhD in geography, also from the University of Oxford. And a lot of your career has been in the United Kingdom,
yes.
At Surrey University. I think he was a colleague of Professor Haiyan Song when Professor David Airy was the head of school, I think you would say. Yeah.
Right.
So connection with other colleagues at University of Surrey, and also he was the executive dean at University of West London as well. But most recently, he's the professor of industrial and spatial economics. What's that? No, I'm not really going to ask you. Industrial and spatial economics. I guess it's economics and geography, etc., at the University of the Aegean. And the University of the Aegean sounds like a gorgeous little island somewhere with a nice beach and very relaxed. But I think Greece is not quite so relaxed at the moment. I think Professor Papatheodorou has to work very hard there. Now, in addition to being a very fine scholar who's done a lot of work in this, he also has something which, if you read the biography very carefully, he trained as a classical guitarist. So he trained at the Greek National Conservatory in classical guitar. But that's not the purpose of his being today. But you can just imagine him playing classical guitar. So it's great to have you, Andreas. We're looking forward to your presentation. And,
thank you so much.
Thank you, start.
Thank you so much, Professor King, for this very warm and kind introduction. And it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be back to Hong Kong. Last time was in 2011, and I gave a lecture either in this very room or somewhere on another floor. I don't remember. But what I do remember is that the audience was very much interested in the topic, and we had some great interaction. And very much looking forward to your questions after my lecture. So what I'm going to present today is about the future of airport hubs in the presence of long-haul, low-fare airlines using Hong Kong International Airport as a case study. And starting with the title, I'm sure you have heard the term LCC, low-cost carriers. However, these carriers prefer to use a different term, which is LFA, low-fare airlines, because they want to promote themselves as having low fares. And actually that's what really matters for the customer. The customer doesn't really care so much about the cost structure of an airline. They care primarily about the very issue of fares. So using the term low fares in terms of low cost, I think it's a more accurate representation, at least from a marketing point of view. So basically, I would like to start first of all with the inspiration, how I came up with this topic. And as Brian said earlier, we were both in Guangzhou, and I thought it would be wonderful to come to Hong Kong and give a lecture. My area of research is very much about the airline airport tourist destination authority relationship, and I primarily focus on Europe. And I could talk for hours about what's happening in Europe, but then I thought that most probably this would not be of great interest to you, although I do understand that we have a number of Europeans here. So I was thinking for quite some time about the topic to develop, and then I came across this in the news. That was about 2 months ago, and that was an advert by Scoot Airlines. I'm sure you know Scoot. Belongs to Singapore Airlines group. It's a long-haul, low-fare airline based in Singapore. And if you are now in Greece, you will notice that they do put a lot of emphasis on advertising the new route to Athens. And I was very, very surprised. And actually, Athens is one of the very first routes of Scoot to Europe. Now, if we were back in 2006 or 2007, which is what we call the bubble years, the years where everybody was happy in Europe, and especially in Mediterranean Europe, like in countries like Greece or Italy and Spain, the economy was doing well, but it was before the financial crisis. I would say, okay, Scoot wants to introduce this route so that Greeks can go down shopping to Singapore. And actually, Air Arabia, I don't know if you have heard about this airline. It's a low-cost carrier or a low-fare airline in the Middle East. The first European destination was in Athens, and actually the very reason was primarily to fly Greeks from Athens to Sharjah. Sharjah is very close to Dubai, so that people could go there shopping, and likewise the Arabs could go to Athens and enjoy themselves and go on trips to the islands and so on. But we're not in 2007, we are in 2017, when the economy is in a lot of trouble. It's not perhaps as bad as it was, let's say, a couple of years ago, but still we have a number of issues to face. So why did Scoot decide to introduce this new route? And the possible explanation behind that is because there is a very big Greek community, Greek expatriate community in Australia. And there are people claiming that Melbourne is the third largest Greek city. So the first one is Athens, second is Thessaloniki up in the north of Greece, and then we have a very, very big expatriate community in Australia. So most probably the very reason why Scoot decided to introduce this route, okay, there might be a few Singaporeans interested in coming and spending time in the Greek islands, as it happens now with a Chinese who get married on the beautiful island of Santorini. But on top of that, we need to consider the expatriate community in Australia. And that actually creates some interesting dynamics because, as I will explore later in my presentation, traditionally the low-fare airline model has been a point-to-point model. And now we see some digression away from it. So perhaps low-cost carriers, and now I use these two terms interchangeably, low-cost carriers and low-fare airlines, are not only interested in point-to-point, they might also be interested in what we call low-cost transfer or self-transfer. So that's something that we need to consider. Okay, so starting with the outline of my presentation, a bit of theory first of all, because I don't know how familiar you are with airline and airport economics, so I will first provide some rationale behind what we call the very existence of a hub and spoke network, and then I'm going to talk about the different airline business models. And my emphasis, of course, is going to be on low-fare airlines, first in terms of what we call the short haul and then the long haul. So short haul flights are usually up to 3 hours, between 3 and 6 hours. We're talking about the medium haul. Then over 6 hours is the long haul, and some people talk about the ultra long haul, which is over 12 hours. And obviously our emphasis is going to be on long haul low-fare airlines. However, we're going to see that until now this model has not been extremely successful, or where it's been successful, it has not been, let's say, a hardcore low-cost carrier model. It's sort of a hybrid one. So the big question to ask here is whether the long-haul low-fare airline model is doomed to fail. And I think that the answer is not necessarily. So I'm going to show you, at least in theory, why this model may prove sustainable. And then we move into our case study, Hong Kong International Airport, which in my opinion, and I think most analysts would agree, it's a success story. However, there are certain points of concern, and I'm going to focus on these very issues. Many of them are actually related to the future of Cathay Pacific. And finally, we will summarize and conclude. Okay, so let me start with some theory, Airline and Airport Economics 101. So let's talk about the advantages of the hub and spoke network. So the very idea of an airport hub means that you create a big base. So you usually have a flag carrier, or at least a major carrier establishing a base into an airport. They do need, of course, all the necessary infrastructure to do that. And then they have a number of different spokes. And the very advantages of the hub and spoke network are very much related to all the shortcomings of point-to-point operations. So just to put all of the points and just try to put them in synthetically, I mean, point-to-point operations are obviously nice. When you fly direct, there's not so much hassle as in the case where you're anxious in order to get through your airports and find your connection in time. And we all know that sometimes we do miss connections, and then we might have some very negative chain reaction. On the other hand, however, we do experience problems with point-to-point, and in many cases routes are not that thick to sustain frequent operations, so we may end up having a relatively low load factor. The load factor in airline economics is the equivalent of the occupancy rate when we talk about hotel economics. So as a result, if an airline wants to be successful and sustainable, they would have to run an infrequent service. And imagine what happens if you run an infrequent service just to make sure that you fill up the aircraft, and then something happens and you cancel the flight. It could cause a lot of problems. So the very idea of a hub and spoke network is to create what we call economies of scale, and in the context of aviation is what we call economies of network. So what you do is you establish a base, that's what we call a hub, and then you have a number of routes emanating out of the hub and into the hub, which is what we call spokes. So the idea is that if you want to go from, let's say, city A to city B, instead of having a direct, possibly infrequent fly with low load factor, what you do is you don't fly direct, you fly indirectly through hub C. And the very idea is that if you put all the different cities into a network together, then what you can actually achieve here is to improve your load factor and reduce your unit costs. So as a result, you may be able to offer low fares, and if you offer lower fares, you can achieve a better load factor, become more competitive, have more frequent flights, and also have a high flight flexibility. Flight flexibility is actually quite important. I once remember I was in Germany, the weather was extremely bad, and I was supposed to fly, if I remember well, from Berlin to Athens, but there was no direct flight, and Lufthansa operates two major hubs in Germany. One is Frankfurt, and the other is Munich. So actually, if I remember well, I was supposed to fly from Berlin to Munich and then to Athens, but because of the bad weather conditions, Munich airport was closed, and I thought that the whole thing would be cancelled. They told me, don't worry, we can fly you to Frankfurt, and then you can take another flight from Frankfurt out to Athens. And interestingly, it was the first time in my life that I arrived earlier than what was originally scheduled, just because the transfer time on my second leg, meaning from Frankfurt to Athens, was shorter than the Munich to Athens. And the very reason why Lufthansa was in a position to do that was this dual hub strategy, and also the very idea of having frequent services, so good flexibility. So the idea is that you create a multiplier effect, you create a whole set of infrastructure, a hub airport, and that's actually very good for you as in terms of making life difficult to new entrants. And because not everybody has the money and the space to invest in such infrastructure. And because if you really want to establish a serious hub, you are in need of thorough infrastructure. So again, from a corporate rivalry point of view, establishing a solid hub can actually act very well in terms of countering competition. There may be, of course, some anti-competitive concerns here, and whenever we talk about mergers in the airline industry, competition authorities always look at what we call hub dominance. But from a market strategy point of view, it does make sense for an airline to focus on that. So just to show a nice graph here, what we have on the left-hand side is what we would call a fragmented network. So that's the case where, as you can see, we have 6 cities, and it's a typical point-to-point network. So we use a typical formula that if you have an n number of cities, then what you would need actually is n times n minus 1 in terms of both origins and destinations, if you want to connect all points on a return basis. So if you have 6 cities, what you would need is 30 different connections. On the other hand, if we talk about a hubbed network, the red point here is the hub, the blue points are the spokes. So as you can see, it looks much neater and simpler. So again, we still have in cities in our system, we have 6 cities, but in that case, all you would need is 10 connections. So as a result of cutting down connections from 30 to 10, this overall centralization process does bring economies of scale and reduces unit costs. So it makes airlines happier and possibly passengers as well, in terms of reducing fares, in terms of having a higher frequency of services. What I've just described is applicable at both domestic and international levels. But if we were to talk about Hong Kong, obviously what really matters here is the international level. And hubbing is actually quite important at an international level when combined with what we call 6 freedom traffic. Now, when we talk about the so-called freedoms of the air, these are very much related to the international regulatory system of the air transport industry, established back in the mid-1940s after the Chicago Conference. So at present, we talk about 9 different freedoms of the air. I'm not going to make a Trivial Pursuit quiz here. I'll just stick to the 6, which says that a carrier can pick up passengers from a state other than its own and deliver them to a third country via home. And actually, this is a real example. So the Cathay Pacific codes that you see here do actually exist. So the very idea is that, do you know this code, J and B? What's that? Any ideas? Yeah, it's Johannesburg, correct, and MNL is Manila. So the idea is that you want to fly from Joburg as the locals say, to Manila, there's no direct flights, you would need a hub. And Cathay Pacific does offer this solution. So the idea is that you could get a Cathay Pacific flight, CX 748 from Joburg to Hong Kong, and then you would fly out again to Manila with flight 901. So essentially the sixth freedom is a combination of what we call the fourth and the third freedom. The fourth freedom allows you to fly people from another country back home, so that would be related to this leg here. And the third freedom allows you to take people from your home to another country. So Cathay Pacific home is Hong Kong, and we fly people out to Manila. So using sixth freedom traffic is very, very important, and makes the whole idea of hubbing operations quite strategic. And talking about strategy, we should not only think about operations, we should think about what we call urban development. And Casada, who is regarded as a major researcher in what we call the idea of an airport city and the idea of an aerotropolis, presented this very nice graph a few years ago. So the idea is that if you manage to create a big airport, then first of all you can create what we call an airport city. So that's a case of not only having the typical terminals and runways, but also putting within the terminals lots of shopping malls and shopping arcades and a number of other concessions and developments within the parameter of the airport. But if the airport really grows and if it becomes what we call a focal point at an international level, then the overall issue of accessibility is taken to another level, and different companies want to establish themselves close to the airports, in the vicinity of the airport, or even in the wider area, just to take advantage of this improved accessibility. So you wouldn't see only shopping malls, as is the case in a number of airports. You would also see research parks. You would also see the establishment of distribution centers. A number of universities might decide to establish campuses very close to such a big airport. You would see wellness centers, so medical centers, just because people can rush out of the airport straight into the hospital and get medical services. So the idea is that you might start from a hub airport, which develops itself into an airport city, and then we have this so-called idea of an aerotropolis. And so different services, whether we talk about medical services, research services, a research park, or a university, or whether we talk about cargo, which is very important, or an intermodal freight hub, an industrial park, an industrial hub, all these things do come in the vicinity of the airport and make the whole area thrive from a regional economics point of view. So as you understand, it's not only a matter of being good in terms of operations. If, as a country, we have a vision of turning the area into a growth pole, then the very idea of establishing a solid hub, then an airport city, and then an aerotropolis makes very good sense. And just to show you a picture of Dubai, that's Dubai back in 1991. I don't know if you've been to Dubai. This is a major highway connecting Dubai to Abu Dhabi. So at that time, as you can see, it's something like talking in the middle of nowhere. Okay, full of deserts, a few nice buildings here, and then nothing, then a few other buildings there. And 14 years later, the very same picture. Okay, you live in Hong Kong, you are very much accustomed to the idea of skyscrapers, but the skyscrapers here have been for some time, I think. Here we talk about developments within just 13 or 14 years, and to a major extent, this is related to the success of Emirates Airline. But the airline was established back in the mid-1980s, and as you know, the UAE is located in the middle of nowhere, but this nowhere does have a geographical advantage. Location is very good in terms of being, let's say, midway between Europe and Southeast Asia and down to Australia, the so-called kangaroo route, which connects Europe to Australia. So they understood that, and they decided to establish Emirates as a sixth freedom carrier. And then the airport in Dubai became an airport city, and gradually that developed into an entire aerotropolis. And then, as you probably know, Abu Dhabi became a bit jealous. They decided to establish Etihad. And then Qatar became a bit jealous. They decided to establish Qatar Airways. All this was to the detriment, I would say, of Gulf Air, which was the originally big airline in the Middle East. And then you see all these different dynamics and what we actually call the war of hubs in the Middle East. So it's not only about airport operations per se, it's about forming an entire strategy for regional development. Coming now into the different airline business models. First of all, we have what we call the FSNC. That's the full service network carriers, where it's the case of carriers like British Airways, which is now part of IAG. So British Airways has merged with Iberia, and now Aer Lingus is also part of the group. Then we have the big Lufthansa group. We have France KLM. So these are the typical, what we call big carriers, the legacy carriers, the ex or still, as we say, flag carriers, and they run services for remuneration according to a published timetable. They're obviously interested in reducing costs. Everybody is interested in being cost efficient, but they don't only look at reducing cost at all costs. Now, they're also interested in service quality as well, at least in long-haul flights. So in most cases, these airlines would be interested in offering a higher frequency of services, a timetabling which would not lead to what we call red-eye flights. They would prefer convenient timetabling, choice of centrally located airports and easily accessible airports. They would usually offer more than one classes, so that would be business class and economy class. On certain occasions, they would offer first class as well. And generally speaking, the idea is that at least in long-haul flights, they offer a good cabin service, an in-flight catering, and entertainment. Now, in most cases, long-haul flights for full-service network carriers give the opportunity to carry cargo as well. So that's quite important in terms of, if as an airline you're not able to achieve very high load factors, at least you might make some money out of cargo operations. Then we have another model. Before coming into that, just to say that these carriers are still heavily dependent on GDSs, global distribution systems. I mean, every airline has managed to actively engage in what we call disintermediation, meaning taking out the intermediary and having the airline communicating directly with the passenger, because that allows an airline to substantially reduce distribution costs. However, GDSs, companies like Amadeus, for example, or WorldSpan and so on, they're still here. So these airlines do spend a lot of money on GDS fees, and in some cases they get into very hard negotiations, as was recently the case with American Airlines or with Lufthansa. Then we have the so-called charter carriers. Now, these carriers are pretty much related to what we call leisure traveling. They're still quite active in Europe, not so much in Asia or in the United States, but it's still worth mentioning them. Why? Because they were what we call the original low-cost, low-fare airlines. So just because from the very inception they focused on leisure routes, it was very important to offer a low-fare service. Otherwise, if people pay out of the pockets for a leisure flight, they wouldn't be interested in flying. So we're talking about services which are performed for remuneration on a seasonal or occasional basis, and just because it's seasonal or occasional, they're usually able to achieve high load factors. But on the other hand, just because people pay out of their own pocket, it's important to reduce fares and costs as well. So in some cases, they might decide to choose irregular services on an inconvenient timetable, possibly secondary airports, and in terms of IFE, in-flight entertainment, in-flight and catering, just some basic facilities. Now, in most cases, these airlines are directly and explicitly related, actually vertically integrated with big tour operators. So I don't know if you have heard of TUI. TUI is the largest tour operator in the world and in Europe, and they carry more than 12, 13 million tourists per year. all over the world, primarily in the Mediterranean, of course. And TUI is a vertically integrated operator. So among others, they own a number of airlines. So the very idea is that you have this vertical integration, which makes life easier for the airline because they don't need to go out and advertise their product. The tour operator who owns the airline is doing the job for them. In some cases, these charter airlines actually now feel the pressure as they're sandwiched between the full-service network carriers on the one hand and the low-cost carriers on the other, as we will explain shortly. So as a result of all these competitive dynamics, some of them have decided to become regular service providers and convert themselves into low-cost carriers. In some other cases, they decided to move more into upgrading the service quality. So this model made very good sense back in the 1970s or even in the 1990s, but as soon as the low-cost carriers came into the game, then the whole competitive dynamics did change. So some of these carriers do face problems now. So coming now into the core model of our lecture, which is about low-cost carriers. I understand this slide is very rich in information, but I'm going to provide you with the slides later on if you wish to have a look. It actually comes from a very interesting report published by the Netherlands Ministry of Transport a few months ago. So what we actually did, they tried to put together all the different features of a low-cost carrier and whether it makes sense for them. So the first point to consider here is point-to-point traffic. Now, if you remember, I mentioned earlier that point-to-point does have a number of disadvantages, hence full-service network carriers decide to follow on hubbing. Remember, however, that hubbing requires heavy infrastructure, and it's a very nice model, but if things go wrong, they can go really wrong. Remember what I said about the chain reaction. Now, this is a model based not on service quality. This is a model based on cost reduction. Cost reduction goes together with simplicity. So if you want to keep things simple, you cannot really afford a hub-and-spoke network, not at least as encapsulated by full-service network carriers. So the very idea here is to focus on point-to-point traffic, which is simple. And if we talk about thick routes, meaning routes that are expected to be heavy in traffic anyway, then you can still expect to have a high load factor and hence be able to achieve a lower unit cost compared to other cases. So the idea is to do what we call hub bypassing, focus on point-to-point services, and make sure that you focus on thick routes or at least on routes that can sustain a good level of traffic. And this brings us to the second point, which is about high-density single class. Full-service network carriers, in most cases, they would have two classes, a business class and an economy class. Now remember, here the emphasis is on cost. Ideally, what you would like to do is squeeze as many seats as possible in an aircraft, because that would allow you to take advantage of what we call economies of scale, and more specifically economies of density. Economies of density is a term we use in airline economics to say that as we increase the number of seats within an aircraft, the unit cost per seat goes down. And I don't know if you have heard about Michael O'Leary, who is the CEO of Ryanair. And a few years ago he came up with an idea which was, well, what about removing completely the seats out of the aircraft? Because if you remove seats out completely, then you can fill a very good number of people, let's say within a short-haul aircraft like a Boeing 737 or an A320. And actually Ryanair is in talks with ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, to see whether this would be compatible with safety regulations. Because as you may appreciate, if people stand still, that might be a problem. But from a marketing point of view, Michael O'Leary said, if you look at the UK and if you look at suburban trains, people would be happy to stand still for, let's say, 45 minutes or up to an hour and pay £40 return for such a thing. So if I'm able to offer the same kind of service for even a lower fare, I'm sure that many people would be happy to remove the seats completely for, let's say, a flight up to 1 hour. So that's quite interesting, but definitely, I don't know if you have ever traveled with such carriers, you would find out that the seat pitch is much smaller compared to a traditional carrier. And the very idea is to fit as many seats as possible. Then it's the whole idea about having a homogeneous fleet. Again, remember, the idea here is to be simple, and low-cost carriers don't like trade unions very much either. So the idea is if you have a homogeneous fleet, then everybody can be substitutable. If a pilot turns sick, or if a pilot turns, decides to strike, then you can easily get another one without any further retraining and put them into the aircraft. Or again, if you are a big low-cost carrier and you can, let's say, buy 200 or 300 of Boeing 737 or an A320, then you can have some serious bargaining power over the manufacturer. So as a result, the price for spare parts and for maintenance would be lower. You would be able to take advantage of your bargaining power. Again, you manage to reduce possibly your overall cost and also your unit costs. And when we get into no frills, you wouldn't expect them to give you caviar or champagne on board. Actually, you would have to pay for all these different bits and pieces. And we actually have what we call the whole emphasis on ancillary revenue. So they would give you a very, very basic product, which is about flying from point A to point B, and then whatever else you wish to have on top of that, meaning if you want to check in a suitcase, or if you want to buy a lemonade, or if you just want to listen to some music, or eat a sandwich, you would have to pay extra for that. And that makes life easier for them, and perhaps it might be more transparent from a customer point of view, because it gives you the freedom and the flexibility to buy the services you like. Provided, of course, that everything is clear enough and that you don't end up paying a price which is superbly higher to what you originally expected. Then it's about high fleet utilization and fast turnaround. Low-cost carriers are very much interested into asset sweating and having aircraft flying as much as possible. And the idea is that we do need to have fast turnaround time. So as soon as the aircraft lands, then everybody is pushed out of the aircraft quickly, so that people can come in and live again. And Ryanair, for example, has insisted on using airports that have runways which are at least 1,500 meters long. And why is it so? Because they always ask the pilots not to push brakes too much. Because if you push brakes too much, then they would heat up, and you would need more time for them to cool off before flying out again. So the idea is that if you have a long runway, you can take it easy. You can just slow down without any problems, and you would be able to achieve a faster turnaround time. And that's actually the reason why many of them use secondary airports as well, because airport fees in that case are much lower, and actually Ryanair or other carriers might indirectly ask airports to subsidize them. That's a very big issue in Europe. But again, because traffic congestion around and also within these airports in terms of airline traffic is low, so they may be able to achieve a higher turnaround time, a faster turnaround time. No cargo operations, because cargo means logistics. Logistics means an advanced level of service, but you lose simplicity. And remember, the emphasis here is on simplicity. Low labor and overhead costs. Many of the older airlines did suffer from what we call legacy issues. So in the past, flying was a kind of a luxury, and people who were working for airlines were treated really, really well in terms of salaries, in terms of pensions, in terms of other perks. And many of the big airlines now, many of the old ones, do face an issue because they do run very big deficits in the pension schemes. And they're also stuck in terms of being obliged to continue the salary policy of the past. That's not the case here, because most of these airlines were start-up operations, so they started with what we call a tabula rasa, with nothing on the paper, so starting from scratch they were able to dictate much more beneficial terms for them, obviously to the detriment of the staff. But on the other hand, this does mean that the overall labor costs and the overhead costs are lower. And from the very beginning, these carriers did focus on disintermediation and directly contacting the customer and reducing the distribution costs. Now, many of these airlines have eventually decided to collaborate with GDSs, but still they believe that putting the emphasis on direct communication is important, and generally speaking, the distribution costs remain lower. Traffic generation is also important. If you look, for example, at Ryanair, where they fly, you would realize that people have rediscovered Europe. So in many cases, they fly in the middle of nowhere. But the very reason why they are successful is because as a result of low fares, really, really low fares, they manage to attract additional traffic. And the very reason is that they perceive yield management and revenue management not in terms of the fare as such, but in terms of all the ancillary services they sell. So many of these airlines don't just sell tickets. If you go into their website, you can also book a hotel, you can rent a car, you can buy insurance, you can do many other things. So they eventually become like travel supermarkets. So the idea is that they capture you as a customer by offering a very low fare, and then they bombard you with a number of different services. So they might not make money from the fare as such, but they may be able to make a lot of money out of commissions. So it's like a travel supermarket. And they also avoid direct competition in most cases. That's what we call a blue ocean strategy. So when, for example, they fly to airports or to destinations where nobody else flies, obviously it's much easier for them than trying to fly in destinations already served by full-service network carriers. So this model, the low-cost model, low-fare airline model started back in the 1970s with Southwest Airlines in the US. Then we've been silent for a few years, and then we come to the late 1990s in Europe with Ryanair and EasyJet, and then a number of airlines, and gradually it moved to other areas of the world. So in Middle East, we saw Air Arabia. In Asia, we saw new carriers like AirAsia and AirAsia X, and we're coming to this in a while. And then in Australia, we saw, for example, Virgin Blue, which became the Australia, and so on. And again, in the Americas, we have JetBlue, we have a number of carriers in South America, and so on. So the low-cost carrier model at present is quite global, I would say, and in most cases it's regarded as a successful model, at least in the short haul, because we have all these advantages. Now the big question, of course, is whether we can translate this into the long haul, and that's the big question. And actually things here are not so easy. So taking each of the points and see whether they're applicable at a long-haul level, well, that's a bit questionable. So remember the first point, that was about point-to-point traffic. And when we talk about long-haul, that's not necessarily easy. Okay, there might be a few cases where direct flights on a long-haul basis could make sense. There could be thick routes, and you could achieve a high load factor, but there are not that many. When we talk about long haul, if you want to have high load factors, you need some feeder traffic. You need to get people from other places, from other destinations, put them together into a hub, and create what we call a hub-to-hub routes, which could be related to a high level of traffic. But that brings us back to the hub and spoke network. If we are to talk about point-to-point traffic on long haul, okay, that might work, but it's becoming more difficult, just because achieving high load factors might be more difficult in that case. And again, high density single class. Okay, if you are to fly for 45 minutes, you might stand still. If you are to fly for 2 hours, you might be okay like that. But you can't be like that for 10 or 12 hours. You could get crazy. And I'm sure you've heard about the economy class syndrome, the deep vein thrombosis syndrome. And as I'm saying, if we talk about long haul, something needs to be done here. And it's not surprising that many long haul low-cost carriers actually, they don't only offer, the typical squeezing, they also offer a kind of an upgraded service. And this brings us to the issue of hybridization, and we'll talk about this later. So high density single class, which is one of the big advantages for short haul, might not be so much applicable here. Again, about homogeneous fleet. If you are to fly up to, let's say, 3 or 4 hours, it's easy. You can just focus, let's say, on a Boeing 737 or an A320. You cannot fly around the globe with this aircraft, however. You would need what we call larger aircraft, dual aircraft that will allow you to fly over a longer period of time, let's say 6, 7, 10 hours, etc. But this obviously would mean that you can no longer sustain a homogeneous fleet. And you will need certain types of aircraft for short haul, and then you would need different aircraft for long haul. So in that case, you are no longer simple. You would have to have different types of pilots specializing in different types of aircraft, using different spare parts. So again, you add complication into the system. Again, no frills. People might not stop for a couple of hours. They might want to eat something if they fly, let's say, for 6 or 7 or 10 hours. Okay, they might buy your sandwiches, as they do currently in the short haul, but they might prefer something on top of that. So again, no frills might be an option for a short haul, might be different in the cases of long haul. That brings us to the next issue about high fleet utilization, fast turnaround. A big issue in the short haul, but in the long haul, these carriers do not have a real advantage, because if we talk about traditional carriers, they already fly, they might fly for 14 or 15 hours, so the extra advantage for low-cost carriers is not that many. No cargo, well, the traditional carriers do make a lot of money out of that. If you are a low-cost carrier, you might be tempted to do that at a long haul level, but then again that could mean extra logistics, so again you lose simplicity. Secondary airports, when we talk about short haul, especially Europe but CZ, might be easier, let's say, in other areas of the world, but if we are to talk about long haul, then operations by definition become more complex. And complexity means that you can no longer rely on secondary airports. You might need some proper infrastructure related to hub and spoke networks. Low cost and overhead level. Okay, if you manage to do that at a short haul, you might do so at a long haul level as well, but full service carriers might follow suit eventually, and the same case is for distribution and traffic generation. And avoiding direct competition is extremely difficult here, because this is a bread and butter of full service network carriers, and flying out of hubs to different spokes, and eventually very much focusing on this issue. So it seems that if we want to apply the short haul low cost model into a long haul, it might not necessarily be extremely successful, it might not be extremely applicable unless we start becoming a bit hybrid, meaning using some full service network carrier features into the traditional low cost model, which obviously brings us to the question whether such a model is a failed model. And interestingly, it's not a very new idea. Back in the 1940s, 1950s, we had Icelandic Airlines establishing the first low-cost long-haul carrier model. Then we had the famous Lake Airways. It was a British carrier which was known for the SkyTrain. They had services between the UK and the United States. And in the mid-2000s, we had Zoom Airlines in Canada, and as you probably know, here in Hong Kong, we had Oasis Hong Kong Airlines, flying to Vancouver, flying to Gatwick. It didn't work out. All of them eventually went bankrupt. So the question is, does it really make sense to talk about such a model? Well, it seems that, okay, there are all these issues, but not necessarily. It's not necessarily a failed model. So in some cases, some of these airlines do actively manage to reduce labor costs. So a good example now is Norwegian. Norwegian has started operations between Europe and the United States. So it's becoming a long-haul low-cost carrier, and it's actually doing quite well because they managed to use a lower base in terms of the cost as well by particularly lowering the cost of cabin crew. Then we also have technology which might help such carriers. So opportunities arising as a result of having extended versions of short-haul aircraft. So as a result of having extended versions of the 737 or possibly of the Airbus family as well, aircraft that were typically used in the past only for short haul can now also be used for medium and possibly also for long haul. So in that case, you might still achieve an homogeneous fleet, and that would save you from trouble. And finally, we have developments in the so-called self and low-cost transfer. So what a number of low-cost carriers are doing, they give you the option and they actually show you how to do the self-transfer yourself. So you would get your suitcases as soon as you arrive into a base, and then you would recheck them, but they make your life as hassle-free as possible. So that would be called a self-transfer strategy. A number of airports like in Milan, for example, or elsewhere, they also participate in this exercise. Milan became very active into that when Alitalia started having problems, and they switched out of Milan, so having a hub-and-spoke strategy was no longer applicable there. And it's also related to low-cost transfer. So if we talk about Air Arabia or AirAsia or Cebu Pacific or other airlines, they increasingly get into this context as well. So all these may prove to the benefit of long-haul low-fare airlines, and airports can actually participate in this as well. So they can make life easier to airlines, they can make life easier to passengers as well. And what many hub airports have actually decided to do now is to introduce low-cost terminals. So in addition to offering a nice level of service for traditional full-service carriers, they also offer now a new type of service, more basic level of service for this sort of carriers. Coming now into the case study, and I'm aware of the time, but I think we all have a background to move a bit quickly. So now we're talking about Hong Kong International Airport. So that's a nice picture, and just to show you some statistics here, it's definitely a success story. According to the latest statistics coming from airline business, it's number 8 in the world in terms of total traffic, about 70 million passengers. And what I have with the blue lines here are the two main competitors in the vicinity. So this is Shanghai and Guangzhou. And if we talk about at an international level, I think the closest rival to Hong Kong in terms of the overall concept is Singapore Airport. And as you can see, it was number 17 with about 58 million passengers. However, if we talk about annual change, for Hong Kong it was about 3%, whereas for Singapore it was about 6%. So do bear in mind that Singapore is growing at a faster rate. And again, if we talk about the top carriers, Cathay Pacific has a joint share of about 41%. 42% we put together Cathay Pacific and Cathay Dragon. Second airline here is Hong Kong with 10%. If we put Singapore, as you know, they also own Silk Air and Tiger Air, so more or less we reach a similar kind of share. So both airports are heavily dependent on the main carrier or on the main group as well. So here we have the configuration of Hong Kong International Airport. As you may know, 2 runways, 2 terminals, and also developments in terms of the midfield concourse. And it's quite successful in terms of airlines. About 100 airlines operate almost 200 locations worldwide, 42 destinations on the Chinese mainland. So it's certainly a very big hub airport in Southeast Asia, and a success story at a world level. Here we see the evolution of low-fare airlines in Hong Kong, and that comes from an interesting paper published by Wang in the Journal of Air Transport Management. So they seem to rise in terms of importance and in terms of numbers over time. So as you can see, back in 2014, they accounted for about 9% of the overall market. And they reached, the total number was about 20 in 2013, 2014. More than 35 destinations were served by low-cost carriers, and flight frequency has also risen quite substantially. And more than 40,000 flights are currently operated annually at Hong Kong Airport by low-cost carriers. And if we talk about the main ones, now these statistics come from 2014, so obviously do change, but the main groups are here. So not surprisingly, the biggest low-cost carrier here is the local one, Hong Kong Express, and back in 2014 they had a 23% share, followed by the AirAsia group. They have a number of airlines, so they offer a number of different destinations, so about 20%. And then we have the Cebu Pacific. And then we have smaller carriers like Spring Airlines, like Tiger Airways, and so on. Having said that, Scoot is also getting into the game, and this is also something that we need to discuss. So my main issue here is that Hong Kong International Airport is definitely a success story. However, we seem to have some concerns about Cathay Pacific, and these are very much related to the financials. And in 2016, the Hong Kong carrier posted a net loss of close to $75 million. That's not a huge amount of money. However, in the previous year, it was profitable, and 2016 was one of the 3 years since 1946 that the carrier actually posted a loss. And generally speaking, it seems that the competitive environment is becoming more and more difficult. It's becoming more and more challenging, according to the chairman. And that's also had repercussions for group revenue, which went down by 9%, also affected the share price. And largely, it's related to the fact that many Chinese carriers now fly out of Chinese airports directly over the long haul. So traditionally, Hong Kong International Airport and Cathay Pacific relied on 6th Street traffic. If Chinese carriers are to fly direct to many different cities, that would make life difficult to Cathay Pacific. And it's not only that, it's the problem with what I call the Holy Cross. So the Holy Cross is about the different portfolio that an airline might offer. So typically we need to consider two dimensions. One is short haul and long haul, and the other is full service and low cost. So if we talk about Air France KLM, we have Air France KLM, for the mainland carrier, and we have the Hop KLM City Hopper regional carrier, and Transavia is doing the dirty business, the low cost. But if we talk about Singapore Airlines, it's even better. It fits all 4 different segments. So the previous 3 are related to Singapore, to Silk Air, and to Tiger Air, but they also now have Scoot, which is the long haul low cost carrier. And on the other hand, if we want to make this comparison to what's happening here, we have Cathay Pacific, which is the equivalent of Singapore. We have Cathay Dragon, which is the equivalent of Silk Air. But then the group doesn't have any other airlines. Okay, they have a cargo carrier, but not in terms of what we're talking here. And if we're to talk about Hong Kong Airlines or Hong Kong Express, they belong to a different group, and they cannot take into consideration the synergies that might appear in that case, and which might make Singapore Airlines quite powerful, and Changi Airport as well. So coming now to my last slide, to the relief of Brian, Hong Kong is certainly a success story. It's a leading airport in Southeast Asia. However, remember, that's something that we always talk about in airline and airport economics. No hub airport can sustain its success unless its major carrier is in a solid financial condition and is able to counter competitive pressures. So, okay, it might just be that Cathay Pacific experienced problems last year, but this becomes a constant phenomenon. It won't be bad news only for Cathay. It will inevitably be bad news for Hong Kong International Airport. And remember that, okay, there is a local low-cost carrier here, Hong Kong Express, but it operates only in short haul. And if the next threat is coming from Chinese carriers flying long haul and effectively bypassing the usual role of Hong Kong International Airport, something needs to be done at a long haul, low fare airline model. And perhaps I think that this is something that Cathay Pacific should consider. It's about gaining a sustainable cost advantage. We said that it's not as easy as in short-haul operations. However, we do have new opportunities arising as a result of technology, arising as a result of market conditions. So in my opinion, Cathay Pacific should think seriously about introducing a long-haul, low-fare airline to its benefit, but also to sustain the success of Hong Kong International Airport. So that's all for me. I also have a few references. I'm not going through them now, but in case you're interested, we can deliver the slides later on, and it's all available on the internet. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Andreas. Now, I'm conscious that the time that we gave to finish was 5:30, so I do want to take some questions, but I want to give anyone that was scheduled to leave at 5:30 the opportunity to leave now. We will go into questions, but if anyone needs to go now. Okay, thanks.
That's all right.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so first question from Christina.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. When you presented the article written by Wang, you explained how Hong Kong Airport, Lowcost Airlines account for 20% of the traffic at Hong Kong Airport.
It's 9%. 22% is Hong Kong Express out of the total low-fare traffic in Hong Kong.
Okay. But in percentage of the whole traffic at Hong Kong International, it's about 10%. Mm-hmm. So would that be a low percentage or a high percentage compared to other international airports?
I mean, generally speaking, it's relatively low. If we're to talk about a typical hub airport, it's, I would say, on average. But you have to look at the longer term. I mean, a number of airports now do establish low-cost terminals. I mean, Hong Kong is already into this business. They have Terminal 2, as you know, which is primarily for low-cost carriers. And the idea is to take better use of this case, not only for short-haul flights, but also for long-haul. Most airports, including Hong Kong, they eventually suffer from capacity problems. And in that case, you have to make a better use of your slots. Airport slots are the time you need to take off and land. And in most cases, it's better to use them for long-haul flights rather than for short-haul flights, because usually long-haul flights are more profitable.
Okay, Benson.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. I have a question about alliance, actually. Mm-hmm. Now, in the whole world right now, the three most important alliance of legacy carrier, mm-hmm. One World, Star Alliance, and SkyTeam. Mm-hmm. Now, three of them, they put in a lot of effort for, servicing the client, mm-hmm. particularly business client, right? Like lounge access, like coach sharing flight, like track through of services, etc. They provide premium service to make the business traveler nice, so mm-hmm. that business go to them. Now, last year we see a scenario that low-cost carrier mm-hmm. also set up alliance
with Value Alliance.
Exactly, mm-hmm. Value Alliance, U-Fly, etc. Some airline that you've mentioned, Scoop, Vanilla, Cebu Pacific, they are all value.
Yeah.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Now, what's the rationale behind? Is that contradictory to what you've just said? Simplicity? What's the rationale? Thanks.
Well, it's very much related, a very good question, and thank you for that, very much related to low-cost transfer. So obviously they are not interested in offering the lounges or the gold cards or all the nice and posh perks to the clients, but if they can offer a simple yet solid low-cost transfer, that would make a good sense. So they might get more into code sharing, which has not been the case in the past. They might develop at least some basic interline transfer, and provided that they can keep the costs at a low level, they can offer a good alternative to strategic alliances. I mean, strategic alliances originally emerged as a backdoor to deal with the problem of protectionism and inability to merge with other airlines. But increasingly, they offered a very good strategy for traditional carriers to counter the problem of low-cost carriers, because they capitalize on the network, which was traditionally not what low-cost carriers are doing. And the reason why we have now UFly and Value Alliance is the revenge, let's say, of low-cost carriers and the counter-reaction into what SkyTeam or Star Alliance or One World Air is about. And the focus, in my opinion, is going to be on low-cost transfer. If they don't manage to do that, then there's no point in having such alliances.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andreas. Valanche? No, lady first.
Thank you very much, Professor, for a very insightful presentation. My question is regarding to the full-service airlines in general, and especially those one that doesn't have the subsidiary to be a low-cost carrier or for a long-haul low-cost. We see from the case of Cathay Pacific as an example that actually just last month, if I'm not wrong, that they cut off the jobs. So that means that the competition is very severe. The cost structure of the airline industry in general is very high, but now the full-service carrier have to compete with a very low fare in order to compete with the long-haul low-cost and low-cost carrier. So my question goes to you that, in your opinions, I would like to listen to your thought that is there any particular or the way of the strategies that the full-service carrier can, apply in order to sustain the business in these tight competitions?
Thank you for your question. As I said, in the short haul, I don't think it makes sense anymore to offer a traditional level of service. And most, full-service carriers have even decided to scrap the service completely or just offer a sandwich and so on. In the long haul, it might be different, but it has to become much more efficient. So one way to make things more efficient, for example, is to pre-order your meal online. A number of airlines have started getting into that and actually make it obligatory for people. So when they check in, they should also pre-order the meal online, so that everything is pre-arranged and everything can be reduced in terms of waste and in terms of food preparation and so on. It's not an easy question. As we know, there are very few big kitchens around the world. In some cases, the industry is vertically integrated. We have big suppliers like LSG, Sky Chefs, and so on. But it's becoming increasingly difficult for airlines to sustain that. And for those that do decide to do that, especially in long haul and ultra long haul, I think the only way forward is to reduce food waste and to make sure that the service becomes as efficient as possible. And one way to do that is by focusing on online pre-meal ordering and possibly other dimensions as well.
Thank you. Alex?
So, thank you for your presentation. I just wondered, so in mainland China, there are, other than the Spring Airlines, there are quite few, low-cost, business model in China. So do you think it's going to change?
Where, you mean in mainland China?
Yeah.
I think that depends on what the government decides. And as you know, some time ago, there were many different carriers. At some stage, the government decided to impose consolidation into 3 or 4 major groups. So I think there's definitely room for new carriers. But remember, whenever we have a price war, it always ends up creating market instability. And if we talk about low fare, low cost, it might be more prone to a price war compared to a traditional model. So that depends. But I think there is room for new carriers, especially in routes not currently served by other carriers.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I want to ask you a questions. How do you think in the case if Cathay Pacific do a better fuel hedging and then keeping the same present model by using Cathay and also Cathay Dragon as feeders, and meanwhile Cathay Pacific will be operating hub to hubs. So will you think the conditions will be much better than present?
So I didn't understand the question. Do you mean that Cathay Dragon should be converted into a low-cost carrier? Or do you mean something
How about if Cathay Dragon keep on Pleasant model, but just
Because at present
having
it's a regional carrier and it acts as a feeder to
yes,
Cathay
freedom for
hub-to-hub
Cathay
service.
Pacific?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, they're going to continue that, and I don't think they should change the model because it's something that is of need. Okay, having short-haul regional feeder airline, it's how they are branded for. So changing the model might lead to brand confusion, and it might render the whole exercise problematic. But I think it's time for Cathay Pacific to think about introducing new carriers in the low-cost domain. Of course, there might be some labor issues. For example, when Air France was very much interested in introducing a long-haul, low-cost carrier, but there were huge reactions from the trade unions because they thought that everybody would go into lower salaries and a different salary structure. And that's one of the reasons why it's difficult sometimes for traditional carriers to introduce low-cost subsidiaries, especially in the long haul. But given that Singapore Airlines has already started this game, and given its affiliation with Changi Airport and its growth rate, I think that something needs to be done. And especially given the mainland Chinese pressure with direct flights out of China to long-haul destinations.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
Another question is when I do the network planning, actually I have think about by using A330 or A340 combinations of long haul and short haul. But however, we face a difficulty in terms of the life cycle of the engines that tremendously bring lots of operation costs. Whenever we think about swapping of aircraft using different models, that may be another issue as well when we think about by using semi-long haul aircraft by using for short hauls. That will be another issue that when we calculate like operating an aircraft by using long haul aircraft but using for short haul models.
Yeah, that's an issue, and you also need a technical service, and you also need to take into consideration all these A, B, C, and D checks when you do that. So you have to consider the aircraft depreciation and whether it's worth doing that. On the other hand, it might be better to have a homogeneous fleet, even with a longer aircraft, than having too many different types, because you end up losing simplicity. So you have to do a cost and benefit analysis there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got couple of questions, but I'll just ask you one of them in the interest of time from our excited viewers. There are several international airports in close proximity to Hong Kong, notably Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Macau. Is this a threat or an opportunity for Hong Kong?
Okay, that's an interesting one. Well, I think it can be both. So first of all, it's at present it's not a big threat. So definitely we might have a problem of hub bypassing. But if we're to talk about proper hubs, I think that Singapore is the closest equivalent to Hong Kong. Now, if in the future we see the development, let's say, of a hub airport in Shenzhen or in the vicinity, obviously that's going to be a problem. And that's why I think it's now time for Cathay Pacific to act on time by introducing a long-haul low-cost carrier. It's also an issue of intermodality. So perhaps an issue that we need to consider here is how Hong Kong International Airport can connect to other cities as smoothly as possible. We already see that such connections exist, but with the advent of high-speed rail and possibly better maritime transport, that might be the case. Otherwise, we might have a problem that we now face in the Middle East, whereas within a 400-kilometer radius, where you have Emirates Airport, in Dubai, you have Qatar Airways, and you have Abu Dhabi with Etihad, which is becoming a war of hubs and becomes quite difficult.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. So once we start talking maritime, we talk fast rail, we could be here for weeks. So we haven't got weeks. So I think I'm going to conclude the presentation now. Andreas, that was very fascinating.
Thank you.
Andreas obviously he's just done with us Economics 101 from Oxford, but we've also had a lot of very practical discussion. And Tammy's worked in airports in many different places, asking technical questions as well. So we've had some very practical, but we've also had some really great theory. And I think the other thing we can take away with us is when we go to Hong Kong Airport, we can think about all these different things that we've seen up on the screen and contemplate that as we slide our way through low-cost carrier, different hub airports and so on. So lots of things to think about. So Andreas, thank you so much for your presentation. Can we give Andreas a big thank you?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
This being Hong Kong and this being PolyU, we have to have a, what do we call it, ceremony?
Oh, that's great.
So this is a
Thank you so much.
professor, distinguished professor for a day. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I'm greatly honored. Thank you.